All right, well, I think we'll get started. We have muted everyone to protect against some background noise. If you have a question and we call on you, you can unmute yourself to ask. I am Jennifer Smith, Director of Government Relations for the Michigan Association of School Boards, and joining me today is Bob Dewan, the Deputy Executive Director of the Michigan School Business Officials, and we're going to be talking about the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference. While the numbers aren't solid, there's something to go off of. As we all expected, it's bad news. So we're going to cover what we know at this point. We'll take your questions at the end. You can put questions into the chat box, and Jeff Cobb, our Assistant Director of Government Relations at MASB, will help moderate that. And if there are technical issues or you're having trouble hearing or something like that, you can check with DeShandria Bedingfield, our Policy Analyst and Grassroots Specialist, and she will try to help you sort through some of that as well. So as we go, feel free to put questions in that chat box, or there's the raise hand function. If you're on the phone, it's *9, and then wait to be called on by Jeff for those questions. So there's a couple of big things that keep coming up before we get into the details. And one of those is we're looking at how the governor has done layoffs and she's done furloughs. And under your continuity of learning plans, you have to pay staff. And we just want you to know that we have been talking to the governor's office about this, and she's aware of the issue, but didn't really want to get out in front of it until we saw some numbers. So now that we have numbers from the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference and we sort of know what we might be looking at, you might expect further guidance from her on whether or not you have to continue to pay your staff if you're going to see cuts from the state. She is definitely sympathetic to the idea that if the state is going to cut you and the state is going to require you to pay staff, that puts you in an impossible position. So I know that's been a big question out there. Know that we're working on it. She is aware of it, and we'll touch base with her again this week to see if we can get guidance sooner rather than later. You may have to wait for that guidance until we know what a negative supplemental is going to look like. So just have a little patience, but always feel free to check in if you haven't heard anything in a while. The other big issue we've been hearing a lot about is the early warning law that requires you to have more than a 5% fund balance. If these cuts are as deep as they may be, some of you are going to go below that 5%. And from our information, it looks like a lot of you could go below that 5%. We have contacted Treasury to see if this is something that they will waive for a year or two. This is not going to be a 1-year fix. So they are in those conversations at Treasury about how they're going to administer the early warning law, how strict that 5% fund balance is going to be, or if it'll be waived over time. So again, that's a stay tuned, but it is something we have flagged for them and something they have acknowledged that they are looking at. So one thing the Senate has done this week, the Michigan Senate has passed a supplemental last week. The House has it this week. This is all CARES money. So it's all federal money. And the way the CARES Act was written, the money can only be used for funds going forward, for things that weren't previously budgeted for due to the COVID-19 response. Governors of Michigan and surrounding states have been asking the feds to give us more flexibility on that, to allow the governors to use some of that federal money to backfill programs that could face cuts because of our loss of revenues. And right now we don't have that flexibility. So this bill that came out of the Senate takes the CARES money and expends it for COVID-19 response. There's $30 million in it for schools. 10 is for benchmark assessments for the fall to determine where our students are at, but it would require you to use one of 5 assessments. And then the second piece is $20 million through the Department of Treasury for incentive grants through MAISA to purchase devices for schools so that kids can connect to the internet. We have sent a letter to the House because it moved so fast in the Senate. It was introduced in the morning and passed in the afternoon. We've sent a letter to the House asking them to rethink that $30 million for schools. If we want to talk about devices for kids or connectivity, we need to seriously talk about connectivity. The governor has been working to procure devices that schools will be able to purchase at a discount. So we already know that that's happening on one side, but the device does absolutely no good if there's no internet to connect to. Those of you that are on this call, obviously you have connectivity, but I'm sure you have people in your district that don't. So what we have asked is for them to take that $30 million and dump it into broadband expansion. We just saw the USDA give a grant to 2 companies in Southwest Michigan, totaling $22.5 million to lay new broadband lines. and they figure they're going to connect 20,000 people to the internet with that 22.5 million. So we've taken that number and said, look, we could get another 20,000 if you would put this into lane lines. This is going to be an ongoing issue for schools and for students. And while devices is an issue that is being worked on, but again, we can get every kid in the state a device, but if there's no internet, then it's not helping them at all. So that's sort of our push with that 30 million out of the CARES Act. There is more CARES money that flows directly to the districts, but the budget that we're dealing with out of the Senate is specific to the state pot of money. So as we go forward talking about the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference, one thing to keep in mind is that there's rumors that there will be more stimulus packages coming out of the feds. A big one just passed the House last week and is sitting in the Senate. We know it's dead on arrival as written in the Senate, but it is another conversation starting point. It includes trillions of dollars for education, including $4 billion for rural broadband expansion across the country. The Senate is not ready to take that up and has made comments that it will not go the way it looks now. There have been comments made about we need to see what the states do with the money we've already given them before we give them more. There have been comments made the states need to show that they're hurting before we'll give them more. And then there was the infamous statement of Senator McConnell saying the states could go bankrupt, that's an option. So this is, ongoing tensions at the federal level. So the numbers that you see and that we talk about in the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference are just state revenues. They do not include any other stimulus from the federal government. And as you can imagine, the correct numbers don't look good. We are at record unemployment. We've had record job losses. Nationwide, we had 30 million job losses in the last month. And this is all piling on to the problems that we'll have in our budget. The other problem for Michigan is that our general fund is very tight. Most of the money in our general fund is earmarked for certain projects, which does not leave a lot of flexibility for the money that is coming in. And the general fund is expected to get hit harder than the school aid fund, and the school aid fund is looking at a $1.25 billion hit this fiscal year. So we have about a $3 billion hole in total, 1.25 in the school aid fund, and 2.75 or 1.75 in the general fund that needs to be accounted for this year. Under our Constitution, the state must balance its budget by September 30th. We cannot carry a deficit budget. So something's going to have to be done over these next few months. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk more specifically about the school aid fund and some of the things that are going on around that.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today. And thank you for the MSBO members that are also a part of this meeting. We appreciate partnering up with MASB and providing some deeper content. Jen kind of set the stage for how do things look and where are we going from here. A couple of things I want to bring to your attention as we look at all the federal funds and the CARES Act money coming in. And for many of us who have been around the business for a few years, we remember something called ERA. Back several years ago, we had ARRA money. Those were federal stimulus dollars that came into the state and went specifically to schools to offset state revenue losses. That is not what's happening with the CARES Act. CARES Act funding is for schools, but it's for additional costs for your operational costs during this COVID time, meaning whether it's online instruction or providing packets to students. So it's not necessarily doing anything except helping you pay for additional expenditures that you will have under the COVID virus pandemic. So it's a little bit different than what we saw in ERA. I've had a few questions saying, well, can't we just use this to offset state revenue? The answer is at this point, no, but that's what Jen was referring to. There could be additional dollars through the HEROES Act. I've heard in the last several days, the House likes it, the Senate at the federal level says it's dead on arrival. So I don't think that we should be planning too much there. As far as it goes for school aid budget and your budget, obviously we're coming at a critical time of the year where we're finishing up this school year. It's been a little crazy here at the end, but we still have budget revisions to do, and we have new budgets for next year. And so your finance folks, your administrators are starting to now look at that saying, all right, how do we deal with this? The CREC numbers that came through, as Jen stated, there is a hole in the fiscal year 1920 school aid fund. That means this year. That means current year expenditures. They are finding out we are down about $1 billion. Once you hit over $1 billion, who cares the details, but just over $1 billion in revenues. And as a result of that, that means that there will be a process put in place to reduce the appropriations of the funds that are already out there. Meaning to us, could there be a proration? Could there be a negative supplemental? Could there be a combination? At a school district level, what's it mean? Well, what it means is our revenues are down for the year at this point. They have said that they are going to look at this again in August, but for you and I in our budgets, we have to have this done fairly quickly. So I don't know if we can wait that long. They have talked about different ways of approaching it, but quite honestly, what it means for us is that this year, this fiscal year, we are going to see a cut in the funding on a per pupil basis that will impact your budget. Can Jen or I or anybody else tell you how they're going to tactfully do that? Not yet. We don't know. There are different ways they could do it. The bottom line for me and what I say to our members, the bottom line is it appears there's going to be less revenues per pupil. So the first thing everybody says, well, what's the cut per pupil? Let's just take proration. Proration has different language. Everyone who enjoys funding through the school aid fund and also enjoys proration. So it's not as easy to take the $1 billion and divide it by the number of our students to come up with a number. I think that's a lot of times what folks do. But we also have ISDs, we have community college, we have universities all sharing in the revenue appropriations of school aid. Therefore, all of those entities will also take a share of any proration. So when you boil it down, the estimates that we've heard over the last few days, if it were to be a proration, it would look like about $650 to $700 per K-12 pupil. So if you took that amount of money, is that going to make up $1.1 billion? And that's about what we're down. The answer is no, because community colleges, ISDs, universities, and other entities would also see a reduction. So at a K-12 level, which most of us I think are, and maybe some ISDs, but at a K-12 level, $650 to $700 is what the number is right now. That can be heavily influenced by making changes and saying, maybe we'll do a supplemental, a negative supplemental to these line items, and then we'll also do a proration. So we could split it up a little bit. We could see some additional funds coming from the feds that offset some of our state revenue losses. That could impact it as well. As far as state revenues to offset a loss of our revenues in school aid fund, I don't think any of us believe that that's a possibility, because the taxes aren't there to do it, and the general fund is actually in worse shape than we are. So when you boil down the numbers, we had a meeting this morning with over 600 school business officials and some superintendents. And one confusion that came out of that was, well, this is just a one-time cut, right? We won't be prorated again next year. If we just take the cut this year, then that's all we're going to have to do, and we'll give the $1 billion back. The key is this: if there is a reduction in expenditures in the school aid fund due to the fact that there are less revenues, the forecast that we saw last Friday, the next 2 years, the increases in revenues are all based on the reduction in revenues from this year. So what does that mean? Well, that means if you were to receive a $650 per pupil cut in 1920, next year, for your new budget coming, you need to take that into consideration, that that proration lasts year after year after year after year. It's not take away $650 this year and then give it back next year. Does that mean they're going to reset the minimum foundation? Not necessarily. Foundation could stay where it is, but then we could have another line item within the calculation that reduces it by $650. So I don't want to get anyone wound up on what's the minimum foundation, what will it be. Know this, that if there is a cut, this year in the neighborhood of $650 per pupil, you will have that cut from here on out. And the only way that that will be reduced is if the school aid fund produces more revenues and those are allocated. I don't want to get you caught up on the foundation, minimum foundation. Let's not get there yet, because the legislators and the executive office need to come up with their solution to this $1.1 billion problem. So at this point, I want to pause here and see if there's any questions, because we need to understand a cut in 1920 means it is also cut in 2021, 21, 22, and so on, until we see some revenue increases in the fund to reinstate that proration. Jen, do you have any other comments on that? I don't want to get too fast on this here.
No, I think there's been some questions coming up. Jeff, are any of those ones that we should address right now?
Yeah, I think one of the questions was just to highlight the difference between proration and a negative supplemental. And I don't know if you guys have answered that enough for those folks, but I think the difference is that a proration is just an across the board cut, and a negative supplemental allows the legislature to go in and kind of pick and choose where they're going to reduce the funding. So that would be the difference. And then also just reiterating, one of the questions was, so the worst case scenario is we get a $650 cut this year. What about next year? And I think the answer is yes, that $650 cut would be for going on into the future. So,
well, I think though, to be more clear, if we take a $650 cut this year, so just, we were doing the math earlier, the minimum foundation currently is $8,111. If we are prorated or cut $650, now you're down to a minimum foundation of $7,561. That will be the starting point for next year. So next year's minimum foundation will start at $75,561. It doesn't mean that it will jump back up when we take another hit. It just moves. So whatever we end up with at the end of this year as our per pupil, whatever that number is, that will be the starting per pupil for next year. And then whether or not we need to see cuts depends on how much we're able to take care of this year and how much revenues pick up once the economy is allowed to open. So that's what you need to keep in mind, is that the hit you take this year, if it's lowered to, and these are just examples, these are not the numbers. If it is lowered to that $75.61 for minimum, that's where we'll start next year, with the hope that we'd have a little more money in the school aid fund next year, though it doesn't look like it. It looks like the first time we could start to see an increase in that minimum foundation is going to be in 22, 23.
Yeah, for those of us that have been around for a while, this happened before several years back, and we took a $470 cut to the foundation level. And if you recall, that changed the foundation level for years to come. And there are still districts that are struggling to get that 470 back in the increases they've received since. So this is very much the same. It's just that today we can't tell you this is exactly how they're going to do it, because quite frankly, this was done Friday, and we're just giving you these 30,000 foot views of what this looks like on a per pupil basis. They may come up with different ideas on how to solve this problem that may not impact us to that level on a per pupil, but needless to say, that's how we're talking today to frame this. But it's just like the 470 cut that we had before. It carried on year after year, as Jen just explained.
One of the other questions was, does Treasury, they have a 30-day notification to notify the I think it's the legislature to work on this. Has that notification happened yet? Are you aware, or what's the latest on that in terms of dealing with a proration?
Yeah, as of 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock this morning, when we had our meeting this morning with Senate and House, the answer was they are not sure if it has been, and I have not seen a document that states that. So there's a 30-day window, and I think there's something about no less than 6 sessions. So needless to say, I would imagine we're going to see something like that. Unfortunately, here we're already on May 18th. 30 days from now, most of us are going to try to have our budgets done. So it's the the clock is not on our side, but I don't think it started ticking yet either.
And how would the 2X formula be affected by proration, if at all?
The 2X, my understanding of the proration calculation is not taken into consideration, meaning it's across the board per pupil, as we saw with the 470. It was the same idea where it was a single dollar amount for all districts. 2X does not come into play on that, or it has not in the past. Doesn't mean that they couldn't look at it, but that's not in the proration language as it states today.
Okay. And then one of the questions was, if we have to make cuts who would they be able to lay off? They've already paid most of their staff for the majority of the year. How would they be able to recoup that kind of money? Who would they be able to lay off to recoup that?
Yeah, this is the trick that I think we're going to have to sit and see with the continuity of learning plans that the districts have put into play. We've kind of made the promise we're going to keep everybody going until the end of whatever, our contract or this year. We're going to have to see what the governor comes up with. And I know we talked a little bit earlier how that process could take place. But quite frankly, we're near the end of our year. Laying folks off to solve our internal problems is probably, it's a chip in the bucket. It's not going to be a ton of money, nor really at this time in the year are there a lot of employees that are full year that you're going to be able to take the brunt of this and offset it. So I think once we get some clarity, as Jen said earlier, from the governor's office on continuity of learning plans, look at the options that they used at the state level for using the work share program that's available through unemployment. As the time goes by, that's less attractive because the reason it works is because there's a federal incentive of $600 per week to a laid off employee. So as that ticks away, which is July 31st, the end date, our ability to even provide that type of relief through a work share layoff may or may not even benefit us.
There was a
Just
question.
To clarify one of my comments about the 650, and I use the per pupil as an example. We don't know how they will do that proration. Right. So per pupil was an example. They could, but they're going to, if that's 650, that's $650 per pupil that you won't receive. But you fill that in is where your fund balance may come in, where budget cuts will come in. That will all have to be determined at your level. But the idea of lowering the per pupil from the 8111 to 7561 is just an example of how that would work. We don't know how they're going to do it yet.
One question came down: if they have to make these cuts, how is that going to impact cash flow? Is there any discussion on borrowing, help borrowing?
Yeah, we've brought that up a couple of different times. The state budget office saying this coming in late to the game, many districts have already put their cash flow notes, the documentation together to go out. There has been discussion on whether or not there's going to be, from the state side of things, municipal finance goes out for another borrowing. I would assume in the weeks to come ahead, when we decide or when it is decided how this will be done, those conversations will occur. I'm not aware that they have done anything formally, but they are certainly aware of the impact this could have on districts from both a cash flow perspective and just an operational perspective.
So we've gotten quite a few questions about MIPSers. I guess the first was on the chat box here. Did the calculations reflect changes in the MIPSers contributions, considering MIPSers lost money in the stock market this quarter? And then also there was an earlier question about whether or not schools could maybe not have to contribute to MIPSers this year or next year. What if you could address those?
Yeah, one of the things when you look at how MIPSers rates are actually calculated, and it's through actuarial study, but the market fluctuations are not fully felt immediately. So a fluctuation in the market, meaning a downturn, or they don't meet their expectations for return on investment, those will affect our rates, but it really is about an 18-month process, so that we wouldn't necessarily feel that in our rates next year. But most likely for this downturn, you're going to feel a portion of that probably in 2023. So it's a couple of years down the road based on the dates that they use for their fiscal year versus ours, first of all. And secondly, the actuarial studies that they use, which are a year old for next year's rates. So the rates for next year are already established, and they wouldn't include any kind of downturn that we've had in the last 90 days. So those will hit us, but it's going to be a couple of years from now. And the way that they do that is kind of strategic in that you're only going to feel a portion of those less than stellar market returns over a 5-year period. It's kind of an easing into it and using over a 5-year, what I'll call amortization. So the key to it is, yes, that will be an issue. It will most likely affect rates. How much, we don't know, but it will be a couple of years out. So that is on the rate side and the market issues that we've seen recently. Let's talk more about, hey, why don't we just not pay the bill and see what happens? Could we not pay the bill this year or next year, and what does that do for us? I think we would get into a lot of accounting transactions from that perspective if it were on current employees and it was something that had to do with the current year's MIPSR's payments. So any normal cost. I don't think we're going to get away from normal cost. So what about the unfunded liability? Because that is the bigger portion. I think it'd be interesting to have that discussion, not necessarily from a, does it make sense or doesn't it make sense, but from a perspective of what does that do to the system in a funding sense? What does it do as collateral damage to the state's borrowing costs? Could that devalue the state because we have less of a funding of our retirement system, which I would suggest it probably would. So I know that there have been discussions about MIPSRs and could we relieve some of the cost pressures? You have to remember there's kind of two rates on MIPSRs. There's a UAL rate that the district pays, and that is capped at just over 20, almost 21% of your payroll, and the district pays that. Everything above that is picked up from the state aid fund directly. So that top bill, that top rate is about 38%. We are stuck at 21%, the rest made up by school aid. If we were to save funds, that might save funds off the top of school aid only. Would that affect your district? Maybe that would reduce some of the proration necessary, but what that does to the system itself and unfunds the system, so to speak, could have more collateral damage for us than the state is willing to do at this point. So are there considerations out there? I have heard there's some discussion about it. It is not clear at all what those discussions are producing at this point. I imagine they're going to throw everything against the wall to see how things stick. This would probably be one of them, but I wouldn't think at this point that MIPSRs is going to be the solving issue to this budget crisis.
Okay, Michael Swiecki has his hand raised. I'm going to unmute you if you want to ask your question. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks. Robert referred to that cut number, 450 per pupil, which affected everybody drastically. And then, of course, everybody wanted it back as they need it. And in the subsequent years, the legislature would say, well, we give 125 to the schools. We give 250 per student, give them increase. And our position was like, you give an increase, you're starting to give back stole. This is the way it felt to us, that while the legislature was tooting its horn that it was giving us big dollars, we're just trying to recoup. All that being said, in 29 years I've been doing this, all I've ever heard is funding equity per district. And John Engler was elected and kept his campaign promises. That was an effort to close those gaps, those disparities. and it still hasn't even gotten close. So I'm wondering, I probably answered it, but it makes me think, is this an opportunity? Is this a window to maybe correct some of those disparities, those gaps? Which we're going to cry a lot. We're the lowest funded out of 34 districts in the Detroit area. We do a lot with what we get, but we're still concerned about that equity situation. And we're told year after year that they're trying to correct it. They don't seem to get much closer. I wonder, is this a time to maybe take a look at that, have the legislature look at that? Is there any protection in place for the lower funded districts? Sure, this is going to hurt everybody, but the lowest funded are going to be brought to their knees. I mean, I'm sure everybody feels that way, but as I'm listening to all this and everybody speak and constantly, could this possibly be an opportunity to try to right the situation?
Bob, what do you think?
Well, from my perspective, and I guess from an MSBO perspective, we don't get decently involved at the legislative level to the level of negotiating with legislators. But I would say this: the proration language, as it's stated today, does not include anything that would allow for them to do anything but across the board cuts. So I understand, Michael, your comment and question about some districts are still saying, geez, we're just trying to dig out of the 470 hit that we had. You've given us increases, but that's not even back to where we were. And but that is how the proration language is written, and certainly subject to change. I mean, that could be something legislatively that is changed, but it's a matter to get the groundswell to do that. So I know that Jeff and Jen are very interested in finding projects like that to attack. MSBO keeps the score, but they actually go down to the legislators.
We haven't heard anything about that, and part of it is we're new to the conversation about what we're going to do. But I don't think that you will see a process where the lower funded districts will get hit less than the upper funded districts. I just don't see that happening with this legislature. I think that they will just follow the law the way the law is written. If they're going to prorate, they're just going to prorate. If they do a negative supplemental, they could mess with the foundation allowance and maybe lower the top one farther than they lower the bottom one. But I don't know that they will put that much thought and effort into something that has to be done in the next couple months. We are in pretty constant communication with some of the chairs of the appropriations committees. We can certainly bring that up. I just don't know that you'll have the appetite to do it right now, especially because you've got a lot of new people that don't even understand how proration works, let alone how to do it on a reverse 2x type idea. Yeah. If you saw it come out of anywhere, I think it come out of Senator Schmidt, and we haven't heard it from him. He's a huge 2x proponent, a huge equity proponent in the foundation allowance. So I would think if there was going to be someone who came up with the idea, it would probably be him. We have a meeting with him this week, but so far we haven't heard much from him. And as the questions have been going through, there's been a couple other legislative things that I can touch on real quick. One was, has there been any discussion of expanding the use of sinking funds? That has to be done through law. We can't just allow it. We can't do it by executive order. And we would have a huge problem with the business community trying to do that right now. So that discussion is not happening at all. Talk of eliminating corporate tax cuts and raiding the rainy day fund. We have heard from Senator Shirkey especially and loudly, but from others as well, that this is not a time to raise taxes. We are not talking about tax revenue. We're going to deal with what we've got, and we'll find the inefficiencies. So I would say that eliminating corporate tax cuts is probably not on their list of things they're willing to do right now. The rainy day fund, when they did crack, they used $260 million, I think. Don't quote me on that number. That is a quarter of what's in the rainy day fund by statute that they passed last session. They can only take out a quarter at a time unless there's other mitigating circumstances and legislation and approval and all of that. So they were, when they put out our numbers, they were including a quarter of the rainy day fund My guess is that is going to flow purely to the general fund because of the problems they have there and because of their hole is bigger. But we don't know for sure until we see a budget that they put together. The last one I want to throw back to Bob, that was are we considering some of these things? And that was out of formula districts and how a proration or negative supplemental would affect them. And is there a difference in how it would affect them?
Yeah, there would be a difference because they are not receiving state aid for the foundation because they're collecting more at the local level. So if there was a cut or a proration there, it wouldn't impact them necessarily due to the fact that they're collecting more than they would have collected if it was through the state. So my understanding from a discussion we had this morning was that they would not see a cut if it were on a per pupil on the foundation allowance.
One other question that came up, it says somebody said they were on a call with state legislators today talking about bonding for MIPSers. Can you talk about that? And I mean, it ties into a little bit of your answer before, but it's a little different in terms of bonding for it.
Yeah,
MASB, sorry, go ahead, Bob.
No, go ahead, John. Yeah, go ahead.
MASB has been opposed to bonding for MIPSers, and while we've been involved in some of the conversations about extending the payments, bonding would tie us to a specific payment every year. And we opposed this before, saying that if you tie us to a payment, economy tanks, we're stuck, and there's nothing we can do about that payment. And now here we are, and the economy is tanking. And if they were to bond, while the rates are low, and maybe that's what's driving them there, you still are going to create a specific amount of money that has to go to MIPSers with no flexibility in how we do that in our budget. And so we have, through the years, we've been opposed to bonding, and even more so today.
There was a question about, could this be an opportunity to consolidate districts to save money? Is there any discussion on anything dealing with consolidation as a part of this?
We try very hard to keep the legislator out of the conversations about districts because when they talk about it, they talk about forced consolidation. That doesn't mean that conversations on the ground couldn't happen, or that maybe it is a good time for you to talk to your neighboring district, but that should be a local decision and the state should have nothing to do with it.
Okay. There was a question about paying staff that are doing childcare. So if you have like maybe a pre-K program or something like that, how does this impact those staff that are paid based on revenues they generate, but they're no longer generating that revenue? How are those staff treated under this?
Some of that I think has to go to the EO, because if you are offering childcare to first responder and frontline workers, that needs to continue. So those people would have to be paid. GSRP was just added to the continuity a few weeks ago to make sure that that was being taken care of. So I think when it comes to childcare, that may be an EO question, but I don't see her lifting anytime soon the idea that you have to provide childcare, or that childcare has to be available for first responders and frontline workers, and that is only going to pick up as she allows more industries to reopen and more people to go back to work. That childcare piece is going to be even more important. So I don't know that that's necessarily an answer to your question, but it's definitely something that I would see there being more childcare, not less, the more we open up.
Okay, looks like Matt Wilk has his hand raised. I'm going to unmute you, Matt, if you want to ask your question.
Thank you. I think one of the points that we're facing here is that the school aid is one of many draws on the state budget. And I think we're in a position where we're sort of each fighting over whatever supplemental money the feds might throw out or other things. I wonder whether the MASB should be lobbying for and take the position, as should our districts, for the earliest possible and most robust reopening of the economy, because otherwise you're fighting over a small pie, and the only thing that's going to make that pie bigger is by reopening the economy, both now and then also with respect to issues in the fall about how much we're going to have live schooling, the less we have in the way of live schooling in the fall, the tougher it's going to be on the economy, because in most districts, parents don't have other childcare options. That's absenteeism. That's going to eventually cost people jobs. So I wonder whether the MASB has a position on that, or whether we should be lobbying in that regard.
We
Jen?
are not lobbying on any of the opening and closing decisions, the stay-at-home, or none of that. We are purely focused on the schools. We will let the governor and her team determine how we open or how the economy opens, and how we lessen some of the stay-home orders. We have been talking to them about reopening school in the fall, and what does that look like? She announced last Friday that there is a now Return to Learn School Advisory Council, and part of that is open to the public, and anyone can apply to be on it. They're going to choose about 20 to 25 people, and they want to represent all across the community that affects schools. There is also a stakeholders work group that our executive director, Don Latruba, will be a part of, as far as what does opening school look like in the fall. So these conversations are starting now, and they include the epidemiologists, they include Dr. Khaldun, through DHHS, to look at, this is beyond just how do we get kids in the classroom for academics. It's going to be, how do we support their social emotional health when we come back? Because while that's always been an issue, it's going to be a larger issue now, because every child has been affected by this, not just those that have some negative things that have happened to them in their past. You're also going to need social emotional supportive staff who have also been dealing with all of this. There are questions about staff that is older that could still be an at-risk population, and do they return to the classroom or don't they? And then busing is a huge talk. There's no way to social distance on a school bus. So all of these things are going to be brought to this council in this conversation, and those conversations are going to start pretty quickly about what does it look like when we open in the fall. And some of that is really going to depend on where this pandemic goes tomorrow. And as we've seen since March 10th, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So as our numbers go down, it looks better. But that's going to be one of the questions, or one of the big issues that we're dealing with. But we won't get involved on the, should we open the economy, should we not open the economy? We're leaving that to them, and we're just focused on what exactly we need for our schools.
All right, I don't see any additional hands raised or questions in the chat box. So if you have any last minute questions, now is your time.
We do expect them to have another consensus revenue estimating conference in late August or early September. That date has not been set yet. Normally this does not happen. They have January and May, and then we wait again until January for the numbers. But because the income tax filing deadline is July 15th, they're going to wait until after about August 15th to hold another consensus revenue estimating conference. It will give them solid income tax numbers, and it will also give them a better picture of the sales and use tax, gas tax, those sorts of numbers coming in. One thing to keep in mind as we look at these numbers going forward, and what they're estimating is that the filings that are coming in for the income tax are for 2019 incomes. But that means next year, when we're looking at 2020 incomes, that income tax revenue is going to take a hit. So while our sales and use tax is taking the hit immediately, the income tax hit is going to be delayed a year. So that's going to be something I'm sure is in their is in their revenue expectations. But it's something just to sort of keep in the back of your mind too, that these tax implications don't all hit at once.
I had one question that popped up. She's just asking about CARES money again, and the difference between supplement versus supplanting and oversight of that. Can you touch on that real quick, Bob, just before we?
Yeah, the CARES funds are coming to districts to supplement the expenditures of your COVID-19. So if you have additional expenditures for whatever your operational changes were to provide educational experiences for students from, I believe, the end of March until the end of the school year, these funds can be used in that manner. They are not offsetting the costs that you had already planned on. And that was similar to what I was talking about with the ERA funds versus CARE. They were two different aspects of that. ERA said we're replacing revenues. CARES does not. It is simply supplementing what you've already put in place, meaning that if you had additional expenditures, these dollars have to be used in that manner.
Okay. All right.
And I
Thank
got
you,
a
everybody.
question that
Oh.
I'm going to try to address, but Bob, I'd like you to clarify it. If the 1920 allocation is reduced by the $650, is that taken from the last 4 state aid payments that are remaining? And I believe that is true, but clarify that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how they did the 470 cut, but I think that was an advance. If I go back to the prorations we had years back, I believe that that was a negotiation between the departments on how that would impact the state aid, whether it was divided over the remaining payments or whether they brought it up to speed on the actual payment out of the 11. That's going to be something I think we talk more about when we start narrowing down what this means, and probably is a good negotiation point to lobby having it broken down over the remaining payments equally versus catching up, so to speak, and pulling more cash away today. So I think that will be a negotiated thing. I'm not sure that's written anywhere on how that would come out as state aid.
There's a question on the governor's portion of the funding that was within the CARES Act. How does that go to the locals? That the governor has, I think, 90-something million dollars. Can you explain how that flows?
Yeah, right now, I think I am not aware of what she is actually going to use those funds for. And although I'm certain that we could use those in schools, I'm not sure I've seen anything that said this is how it's going to happen. The dollars that we are seeing to schools are actually a portion of the 360 million of the initial allocation. We're receiving 90% of that. The Department of Ed is holding 10%, which they are allowed to do. And I think that was for some type of technology ideas that they have. So I don't know specifically what the governor is going to use those funds for. Maybe Jen, do you have an idea? I haven't seen anything outside of that other CARES allocation for schools.
I haven't seen much, but one thing to keep in mind, part of the question is, will we use it to offset our losses? This money is written that it can only be used for new expenditures due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is one of the things that the governors have been fighting with the federal government about. So she can't use it to backfill revenue losses. It can only be used for things going forward. There's a lot of frustration with that limitation. So I think that has to play into how she spends the money.
So one of the questions is, if they do the August revenue estimating conference, does it impact both the fiscal year 20 budget and the 21 year budget? Because we've already basically passed the fiscal year 20 budget for the school. So how does that work with a new revenue estimating conference in August?
For the schools, it'll affect the budget cycle you'll be in August. For the state, it depends on the numbers, but the biggest reason they're doing the one in August is to look at the 2021 fiscal year and make sure they've got the most solid numbers possible to set that budget on. So I don't think it will affect the budget we're sitting in today very much. They're mainly doing it so that they can have more numbers to do the next budget on.
One last. There's another question on bonding. It says, if we do not bond for MIPSers, is it likely that district pension costs will increase? Bob, any idea on that one?
Well, I guess I would have to see more studies on this bonding, and I think Jen addressed it very well. What we've seen in the past, I'm not so sure that I would agree with, because of the downturns and having a set payment. I would have to see more about it to give an opinion, but right now I would assume that that's probably not a great idea to do the bonding.
Okay. All right. Another question. If schools are not able to open safely in the fall due to COVID, will districts be able to lay off at that point? And how would that impact their continuity of learning plans? I assume
Continuity
that,
learning plan is for this year. If we can't open safely in the fall, that's going to be a whole different conversation. And that's where these things come in, the council she's putting together, the stakeholders advisory group that she's putting together, all of that is going to play into the fall. Your continuity of learning plan will expire when your school year is over, or June 30th, the end of the fiscal year. So the plan that you have now is not necessarily the plan that you would have in the fall.
there's a question on, is there any help with FEMA funds? Do you know if the schools get any of the FEMA funds?
That would be a bigger state question. I don't know, Bob, if you have an answer, but there are FEMA funds that are available to the state because we're under a state of emergency and a federal emergency declaration. So the state can apply for those. I don't know as it trickles down. Do you have any idea, Bob?
Yeah, I know I have heard districts ask this question, and I have heard some of the districts say, yes, there may be cases that you qualify for FEMA. I'm not totally familiar with what those might be, but I do know that there has been or have been districts who have been involved with FEMA funds.
And we have time for more questions. And then if you have questions that haven't been answered, feel free to email them to Jeff, Bob, or I, and we will try to track down answers for you. But we have time for one last question, Jeff.
Okay, I guess the last question would be, who are some of the key players in the legislature with respect to school funding in case our members want to get in contact with their legislators or the key leaders?
I would absolutely make sure that your legislator is hearing from you. Your senator, your rep, anybody that represents part of your district, even if they're not your particular one, if they represent part of your district, they need to hear from you. They need to understand what this means. They need to understand what these cuts will do and what it looks like into the future. This isn't going to be an easy decision for anybody, but without an understanding of what this looks like on the ground, you give them a pass to just say, oh, everybody will be fine. We've done this before. So start with your own person and anybody who touches your district and make sure that they understand exactly what you're looking at, what you're going through. Ask them the tough questions about how they think that this will proceed and how they're looking at doing this in the future. Are they looking at the rainy day fund? Are they looking at corporate income tax cuts? You need to hear those things from the ground and from their people. As far as the players, you always have your decision makers. You have the Speaker of the House, Lee Chatfield. His majority floor leader is Tristan Cole. In the Senate, you have Senator Shirkey, who is the Senate Majority Leader, and Senator McGregor, who is the majority floor leader. And then, of course, Senator Schmidt is the chair of the K-12 committee in the Senate, and Senator Stamas is the chair of the Appropriations Committee, the Full Appropriations Committee. And in the House, Senator Hernandez is chair of the Full Appropriations Committee, and Senator Miller is the chair of the K-12 subcommittee. So those are your final decision makers. Of course, all of those committees have Democrats that are ranking members that you can talk to as well. But the biggest thing is that your local people hear from you and understand what you're looking at, what you've been doing, praise yourself, make sure they hear all the good news about how you've moved to this continuity of learning plan and how you're doing with those kids. You guys are doing amazing work and you did it on a dime. And this is where you need to toot your own horn.
And one thing I would just say is make sure that your legislators understand that you haven't saved a bunch of money by schools being closed the last 2 months. I think there's sort of this false notion that, you're not really doing anything, so you must be saving all this money. Well, that's not the case at all. And so I think you need to let them know that because that's going to be an important part of the discussion. Because they might think, we have this money saved, you didn't, but that's not the case. So make sure you communicate with them when you talk to your legislator.
And in your continuity learning plan, it said that you should budget or at least list your additional costs for continuity of learning. Make sure you do that. Even if you think it's not much or you're coming out even. I've heard that from a couple districts, but even if that's the case, still make the point that these are the additional costs you used in order to move to this continuity of learning plan. Because all of that is going to play into these budget talks as we go forward, especially if we have to look in the fall to not going back to traditional school. Some of these costs and these experiences are going to play into that conversation. So be sure that you're sharing those as well. And if there's ever any questions or anything you have that we can help you with, feel free to reach out. You have contact information for all of us, and we're here to help. We're here to answer those questions or to track down the answers to those questions. I know that it never seems like we have all the answers. We're doing the best we can, and we're trying to get you as much information as we can. So thank you all for joining us today. This will be available. It has been recorded and will be available within the next couple of days on our website, and we will make sure that we let you know when that happens. And stay safe, and we will all talk to you later.
Hey, Jen, one comment just before we go. I saw a couple of comments out here about the supplemental supplant. I'm going to do a little research on this and talk to the department and make sure that we're giving out the exact accuracy of the information. So I'll follow up with them, and I will follow up with you and Jeff so you could put this out to the group. And because there are some confusions on the ESSER funds, and I just want to be sure that we're all on the same page. So I'll follow up with them today.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
And we will have, if not before, we'll have some of those answers and the link for this in News from the Capitol on Friday. If you're not receiving that, let us know. And because that's where we're putting most of our updates. Will come out weekly in that News from the Capitol on Friday. So thank you all and have a great week.